So we go to the next session, the next set of presentations. And I have the honor to introduce Dr. Peter Phillips. If ever there was a leader in Jamaica that had the wherewithal, the guts, the tenacity, and the courage to solve seemingly intractable problems, it would definitely be Peter Phillips. As a minister in various capacities, Dr. Phillips sets standards for quality management and leadership of critical areas of national development. I think most would agree. And so while as Minister of Health, he ensured the complete renovation and rebuild of KPH, that's our Kingston Public Hospital, and doing this in a way that brought different political sides on the ground together to focus on a shared objective, visionary and practical, and also established JDEP, that's the Drugs for the Elderly program. As Minister of Transport and Works, Peter established the JUTC to bring order and affordability to the public transportation system, amongst other contributions. And I certainly think we'd all agree in Jamaica, we would definitely like some more order in our public transportation system. As Minister of National Security, he led Jamaica out of the clutches of Colombia's drug lords as a transshipment port, as well as enabled critical police reforms. And I mention this because the range of experiences, I think, prepared him ably well to take on the challenge as Minister of Finance in 2011, 2012, that period, when Jamaica was facing the brink of bankruptcy, as many of us remember at that time. During that period, he and the team sought and achieved for Jamaica, in partnership with various sectors, including many in this room, the economic recovery plan for the country, which established the base for growth, for which we all collectively now need to build on in a very concentrated way. And this conference is a part of that contribution. Peter Phillips is a man committed to service, a man of vision, a man of solutions. So please join me in welcoming him to share his perspective on the seemingly intractable problem, public sector reform.
Thank you very much, Imani. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me recognize Mrs. Marlene Street Forest, other members of the Stock Exchange, His Excellency the High Commissioner of the United Kingdom, who is here, and all the other distinguished delegates. You know, in my first encounters with the Stock Exchange, this annual conference, I used to come further up in the batting order. At this point, I think it's only in the West Indies cricket team, and probably me now, where we are expected to score runs coming at this point. But I shall, and not knowing the actual score today, but I know we started well. That's the West Indies cricket team yesterday, but faltered by the end of the day. Let's hope that today is better. I've been asked to speak on the issue of public sector reform. And the first point I think worth noting is that this issue has been part of our national dialogue, and this effort has been part of our national agenda for at least 2 decades, perhaps more, in the country. My first encounter with it was in 1989 when the Michael Manley administration took office, and the issue then was described as the Administrative Reform Program. It was called, financed by the World Bank, and in fact had been initiated during the tenure of Prime Minister Siaga in the 1980s. Since then, the program has gone through many different phases until the current public sector transformation program has come into existence. Essentially, the focus of the efforts over the decades has been in rationalizing the public sector, improving the pay and conditions of service. And this preoccupation with cost and cutting costs in the delivery of public services was ultimately enshrined in the fiscal responsibility framework, which was passed into law somewhere in the period between 2007-2010, which set a target of 9% wages to GDP. And that target, 9% public sector wages to GDP, and that target has been embedded in the successive fund programs that we have had, extending from 2010, which faltered, then the economic reform program of 2013, and the current program. It is true, and we should take note of the fact, that apart from the cost-cutting elements in the economic reform program of 2013, there were other elements of reform that were focused primarily on facilitating business activity and inducing growth indirectly thereby. And those reforms focused, among other things, on the management of public finances, the ease of doing business reforms, as I mentioned, and among the things that were implemented was comprehensive tax reform legislation, the reform of the administrative arrangements for the collection of taxes through Tax Administration Jamaica, its establishment as a semi-autonomous agency, the implementation of the large taxpayers office, and other significant legislative changes, such as the access to third-party information. There were wide-ranging customs reforms, etc. Currently, there are two elements that are highlighted in the program. First is the whole question of continued public sector rationalization through privatization and the amalgamation of services within various arms of the public sector. That's the so-called shared corporate services, the combination of legal services across various ministries to enable supposedly smoother, speedier, and cost-efficient delivery of services, shared human resource management platforms across various ministries, and of course, there's the whole question of the ease of doing business and the information technology arrangements. The truth is, some success has been achieved, certainly in relation to the ease of doing business, which saw Jamaica improve in its rankings, although recently there has been a decline in those rankings. In 2015, Jamaica ranked 58 in the Ease of Doing Business Index. Last year, that ranking had lowered to number 70. And while it is the case that public sector resources have to be, public sector expenditures have to be brought in line with available resources, the fact is we have not been able to meet that 9% wages to GDP target, which was set, albeit that there have been delays and the times passed. I think the time has come for us to review some of the lessons that can be drawn over these past 20 years. And first, the first point I'd like to raise in this regard is the validity of the target itself, wages to public sector wages to GDP, especially in the way that it is stated in our enabling legislation, the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Setting a precise measure, X% of wages to GDP, is probably I was going to say a fool's errand, but I would say a very difficult task. And in fact, the data shows that countries with the same level of GDP per capita span a range of between 7.5% wages to GDP up to 10% wages to GDP. It's probably better to have a particular range, to have it stated in the law as a particular range, to ensure that we don't get out of kilter, spending more than we can afford on one end, nor should we have a law which is almost impossible to achieve the precise objective, and where the target is likely to be honored mainly in the breach. But the difficulty in this regard for us is probably even more complex, because the question arises as to whether that target, not only whether it can be achieved, but to what extent should we be cutting in critical areas of the public sector at this time when we are making the push for growth, when we ought to be making the push for growth. The fact of the matter is that over many years, spanning many administrations, we have been unable to reach that target. It is particularly difficult, as has been evident, for example, in what I would call the less than stellar performance in the recent efforts to get an early retirement scheme going within the public sector. But the simple reality is that we spend about 80% of the overall public sector wage bill in the areas of security services, education, and health. That represents 80% of the employment in the public sector. And indeed, in each of these areas, the need of the country, if we are to achieve our growth agenda, is for higher quality and, in fact, greater numbers in these particular areas of employment. So, take the question of our security forces. Jamaica has, as we probably all well know, the highest murder rate in the Caribbean. In fact, the 5th highest in the world. And at the same time, we have the lowest ratio of police to population in the Caribbean. What we would obviously need, any reasonable person would draw the conclusion that what we need are more people with higher rates of remuneration to achieve the appropriate quality. The police force is currently undermanned by about 25%. Similarly, the case can be made in relation to education, where we have class sizes which are too large, where the estimates of the World Bank is that 70% of our labor force have no certification, and greater productivity requires a more qualified labor force, and where there is need, particularly in sciences and math teachers throughout the education system. What this recommends, and I noticed a nice lady who wasn't pointed out to me before, or I would have been looking at her warnings of time. I'll comply. But what this suggests generally, and the point similarly can be made in relation to health, I won't go through that. But what this implies certainly is that as we lower our debt to GDP ratios, and as the fiscal envelope opens, as more resources become available, we should be focusing on these critical growth-inducing sectors to undertake the necessary reforms. What is required, and certainly something that we should be all vigilant about as more resources become available, to see that the budget is going to be focused on these critical areas of education, security services, and health, as we are able to spend more resources going forward. I think also that we need to pay a lot of attention in the reform effort, not just on the reforms in these critical sectors, but on the issue of good governance. Earlier, the question was raised about the matter of corruption, and I don't need to go through all the recent episodes, but as the saying goes, bad money drives out good. And a reputation for corrupt administration within various areas of government usually leads to weakened public confidence in institutions and weakened confidence in public sector reform generally, and a poor investment climate. I think we need to recognize that in this area, we all have to combine our energies as a country to combat the issue of corruption. Where it arises, it needs to be dealt with firmly. And quite frankly, the great suspicion in the country is that the only people being held to account are people on the lower ends of the scale, and when it reaches into high places, prosecutions and convictions are not forthcoming. Perhaps one way that we could assist in ensuring better standards in some of our public enterprises would be to open up board appointments at this time to the general population. Governments exercise the right to appoint boards, but many jurisdictions advertise some, if not all, of the posts when they come due. And I believe it is not beyond us to find a mechanism whereby persons who feel they have the requisite skills can apply, and that a public service commission, for example, could be utilized to vet these applications and appoint persons of no known political affiliation, but with necessary skills to serve on the boards of public sector corporations. This would enhance confidence, and at the same time it would allow us in what is a recognizably small population to marshal the best resources that the country has to give service in these areas. I have always said, nation building is not for governments. Nation building is for the nation to participate in, and we have to marshal all the talents of our small nation in order to make the advances which we seek. So, Madam Moderator, the issue is not really whether we can have painless or painful public sector reforms. The tasks are no doubt difficult, but not beyond us. We need to ensure that we focus on the real issues. The preoccupation with cost cutting, while it has some validity, should not be a be-all or an end-all. We need to, most of all, have the fixity of purpose and the collaborative instinct and determination to take the really difficult decisions as a country and deliver growth and good government to the country. Thank you very much.